Hey guys, we're going to be looking at chapter 3 for this selection. And when we think about chapter 3, it deals with action, personnel, and cultural controls. So, one of the things we want to think about is that when organizations are looking for how do they set those strong controls in place, it's not just about the results controls that we started with in chapter 2. We're going to go into some of the other ways that we can set up controls for protecting our company. So when we think about action controls, those are the things that we're trying to make sure that our employees are doing or that are going to help our company, or the things that we want to make sure that they are not doing that could harm our company. So we want to look at both of those. And when we're thinking about that, we have to look at the ways that we can prevent those, the do not do, and detect the things that we, make sure that we're on path to where we should be. The other part that we want to look at is going to be personnel controls. So we can see how the employees are doing as far as like doing the job that we're assigned to them. And that depends on, how experienced are they in that job? Are they going to be an independent worker that can handle things on their own? Do they need someone to micromanage them? Can they handle working on a team without someone telling them step by step what they have to do? So those are the kind of parts we're going to look at for that. And then we're also going to look at cultural controls, where we're thinking about how does our company set up things that allow us to show what we think is going to be a positive thing in our environment and what is going to be a negative action or behavior in our environment. And how can we set up those things to make sure that we're encouraging employees and also influencing other employees' behaviors by modeling that good behavior. So that's some of the things we're going to be looking at. When we look at action controls, they're only as good as how effective of a plan that you set up. So action controls can be set up into different standards. So we're looking at the first part. We want to know what actions managers have set up to create those positive environments and those environments that make our employees want to work well. So when we put on too many constraints, then that can lead to the fact that, if we put on too many constraints, then we're looking at, do we create that negative environment or that controlling environment that employees don't feel that they can do things on their own? So when we think about, constraints, we'll get into that a little bit more, but we want to make sure that we're putting things in place as far as our action controls of things that that are good for us, that make the environment better and make employees want to do a good job. So we look at first the behavioral constraints. So that's what we were kind of talking about. There are different kinds. There are physical constraints, and that's what a lot of companies are going to use. And they're going to have things like passwords on your computers, right? So we want to limit access. We might even limit access in specific areas in our computer. So you might be able to only access certain parts of an accounting system. You might, if you're doing accounts payable, you're not going to have access to the accounts receivable side. So they want to make sure that you're separating those two factors. And then the other things that could happen, you might have like locked areas. So for example, you might have an area of your building that's only accessible by management or by certain roles, so that you don't have people that are going into the areas that may not need to be in there that could potentially cause a problem. So those are some of the physical constraints. But especially when you think about, like sensitive information to human resources, a lot of times human resources is behind closed doors, right? And they have, the employee files that are locked away. But there's a lot of other business information that's very sensitive that we want to make sure that we are creating those other physical constraints to make sure that we have controls in place so that they are not taken advantage of or the policies aren't violated because we didn't provide those protections. The other part is going to be administrative constraints, and those are going to be used to place limits on the employee's ability to either complete a specific area in their job, or it's going to help with our what we call a separation of duties. So that's an internal control feature, a separation of duties, and that's where we're looking to make sure that people can only access the part that they should be accessing. So it's the limited control that we're trying to put in to make sure that administratively we're not giving access to just run wild with, but we are putting some kind of a control out there to separate who's responsible for what. And the idea is that, we're trying to make those strong internal controls, but it's not guaranteed to control everything, and we're not going to be able to fix every part of it. When we look at pre-action reviews, this is going to involve how we're looking at action plans of the employees that we're creating those controls for. So what we're looking at is that we're going to have some kind of a second person that's going to be approving or disapproving some action. So for example, in accounts payable, you're going to get that invoice in the mail, and someone in accounts payable is going to go through and say, yes, this invoice is valid. It matches up with purchase order XYZ. And then they're going to set that approval for that invoice to be paid. But someone else should be going in there and setting up another review to make sure that that person isn't creating fictitious invoices and making sure that we're protecting ourselves from that possibility. Now, the thing that we always have to think about is, there's always that possibility of collusion where someone can work together, and that's not something you can always control. The next part we want to look at is going to be, how do we create that accountability for those action controls? And that means that we're, like when we set up plans, we are holding employees to what we've set up. And if they stray from that, we are looking at what do we need to do to prevent them from doing that again? And what kind of punishments do we have in place to make sure that that doesn't happen? So that's kind of what we're looking at. We want to make sure that we're holding them accountable for what they're doing as far as the rules and guidelines we set up for them. So when we're looking at putting in that accountability part, we want to look at first defining what is okay to do and what is considered a violation of our policies. Having that clearly defined allows an employee to at least have the possibility of following your policy. If it's not clearly defined, then everyone's working haphazardly and no one really knows what the right thing to do is. So we want to have that clearly defined. The other part is we want to make sure that we're communicating what each of those standards mean. So when we're thinking about that, how do we share with our employees what the policies are? A lot of companies might put a link out there on their website or on the employee portal. Some companies might give a paper copy. Some may have a specific training to go over that. But either way, we want to make sure that it's communicated very clearly as far as what the expectations are for our employees. The other part that we want to look at is when we're reviewing that, what kind of supervision are we putting on that? What kind of audits, or in this case, they mentioned mystery shoppers. So if it's a retail store, how do we know that our employees are doing what we want them to do when we're not there and when we're not watching? So having that feedback from others can help you to decide if they're really following along with what you've set up for them and if they're putting in place those actions that you've determined that are valid for your company. And again, every company is different as to how they're going to set those up. We want to make sure that once we decide that, if there's things that they're doing positively, that we are rewarding those good actions. If they're doing something wrong, we want to make sure that there's a policy in place that says, if you violate this policy, this is how it's handled. That way you don't run into the issue of, if you're favoriting someone else and you're allowing one person to do something that you're not allowing another person to do. So you just want to make sure that you're following those policies and making sure that you're using good professional judgment and making sure that your employees know exactly what's expected of them. The other part that we want to look at is what happens when we assign more people to something than we should. Well, that's called redundancy. It's not always a bad thing, but what we want to make sure is that there's a backup for someone's job. So what if you had an employee that did something wrong and you had to fire them? Are you set up in a way that you could still function in your business without them? If you're not, that's an issue. You want to always have a plan in place as to the next plan of action in case something were to happen. Or if that person were to be in an accident, how do you handle that? You want to make sure that we're addressing those. So that's the issue of redundancy. We want to make sure that we have things in place, but we wouldn't want to be excessive. All right. So the next part talks about some of the pros and cons of action controls. So the good thing that comes along with it is it's the most direct form of control, right? You're telling your employees exactly what you want them to do, the behaviors you want them to exhibit, and how you want them to do their job. That's a positive thing because it gives you that control to show this is what you should do, and if you don't, there are going to be consequences. Um, the issue is that it's not always for every job. You can't clearly lay out every single job that there's going to be. So, it's more for those jobs that are kind of routine, monotonous kind of things. But at least for those, you could create some kind of a plan. Some of the other things they talk about is, it could cause a negative attitude, and that is possible, but it depends on how you go about that approach. So if you go about it in a positive way, you're able to show them why it's needed, then I think sometimes that can go a long way. Where if you just come in and you're telling them, hey, this is how it is, and it's just because I say so, and because I'm the boss, and what you think doesn't matter, then that's definitely where you create those negative attitudes. But if you're more positive and you can explain to them why that policy is working the way it is, then that's one thing that, can be helpful as far as how it's viewed. When we look at personnel or cultural controls, personnel controls are the ones that are going to help us figure out how we can motivate employees to want to do well. So personnel has three purposes. The first one is it's going to help us clarify expectations. Then it's going to help make sure that we want to make sure that each employee knows exactly what we want them to do. The next thing is personnel controls can also help make sure that the employee is capable of doing that job. If they're not capable, then it's kind of hard to have the expectation that they're going to do well. And the last one is sometimes it can increase the likelihood that they're going to be in that self-monitoring that we talked about, making sure that they're willing to evaluate where they're at and see the changes they could make to do better. The other side of it, when we look at that, is, typically if you have a good environment, even if someone gets out of line, they're going to work together to create that environment where if someone's not doing what they're supposed to do, someone else steps in and they want to put that process in place to make it better. So that's one of the things that, sometimes they're going to help control each other. So it might not seem, exactly what we want it to be, but that's one way to look at it too. When we think about, those employees that are controlling themselves, it's not necessarily because they have the need to follow the rules exactly to a T, but it's their conscience, like what do they think is right? So a lot of times when you get those really good employees, they do the job the right way because they just want to do things correctly. They want to be able to have that self-satisfaction that says that, they had a part in that success of the company, and that's important. When we look at how do we implement those personnel controls, so there's different ways. Selection and placement is one of them. So we're looking at, how do we make sure that we get the right people in that right position? So that's important. The other part, we want to make sure that we're training them well. And the last part is making sure that the job is designed efficiently so that we can have those people doing what we want them to do. The next part goes into cultural controls. And for that one, we're looking at, how are we setting up what we think is acceptable behaviors in our company. And, cultures can be built on a variety of things. Everyone has a different thought. So it's important to make sure that we're taking all of those into consideration. But we want to set what we think is best for our company. So we want to look at how do we shape them? Well, putting in codes of conduct, what we think is ethical, formal documents to make sure that that works, creating those rewards to make sure that if our employees are doing what we want, that we're rewarding that for that. The other part is making sure that we have the management that is leading, making sure they're setting that tone at the top, that they're going to put into place a positive environment and they're going to follow the rules. If they're not following the rules, why would your employees? And the last part, we always want to look at, we want to start with those people controls, and then we get into those action and those results controls. So the people controls are always the important ones, and that's what we talked about earlier. So just keep that in mind as we go through into chapter 4.